Well, good morning. Thanks for joining us. Today we're going to be talking about who are Chicago's Jews. The Chicago Jewish United Fund, which is the central body for organizing the Jewish community in the Chicago area, sponsored a study this past year in 2020, which they also did in 2010, to find out who we are, where we live, what we do, how we connect. There's actually a Jewish tradition of not wanting to count people. While the book of Numbers includes long lists of how many Jews are in how many tribes and how they're organized, in the book of 2 Samuel, King David does a census and he's punished. Actually, God gives him an option. He says, I can have you face military defeat for 6 months, or a famine for 7 years, or a plague hitting you for 3 days. And so David says, well, I choose the plague. But it was a punishment for doing a census. Now you can imagine why politically it was a bad idea for a king to do a census, because once you do a census, you can raise an army because you know how many men of fighting age there are, and then, or you can tax people. That's the other purpose behind a census. So it was not a happy experience for him. And so historically, Jews didn't count numbers as much. But in our own times, we do have a almost over focus on Jewish numbers. Certainly post-Holocaust, Jews have focused on how many are there and then how many are going to stay Jewish and what's going to happen going forward. And the Holocaust did kill about 1/3 of the world's Jews, so that's not insignificant. Also post-emancipation and post-freedom, where we're not living in ghettos and we're not living with constant community ritual surveillance where everyone's seeing if you're keeping kosher, lighting candles and so on. People are curious, what are Jews doing and how are they expressing their Jewishness? And third, post-immigration and ghetto phase, when Jews only lived in Jewish neighborhoods and in the west side of Chicago or in the south side of Chicago or Lower East Side of New York, they tended to marry within their own group. And that's been the case for many immigrant groups. In the first and even second generation will marry within their own group. But by the third generation, they've become acculturated enough to the surrounding society that they might be open to marrying someone from a different background that they share education with or political values or other kinds of connections. So people have started asking, whom are Jews marrying? And then what happens next? And that's been almost an obsession for the Jewish community for the last 30 years, since the 1990 National Jewish Population Study showed that about 50% of Jews are marrying people who are not born Jewish. And so that led to great cries of alarm, because the statistics coming out of the 70s and 80s were that couples where one partner was not Jewish were very unlikely to raise their kids to identify as Jewish. Now, there were a number of factors for that people didn't always realize. Number one is it was almost impossible to find a rabbi to marry you in the 70s and 80s. If you're talking kids getting raised in the 90s, their parents were married in the 70s or in the 80s. And it was almost impossible to find a rabbi to marry you, to find a congregation that would let you both be members. If it was the male partner who was Jewish, most congregations wouldn't recognize the kids as Jewish at all because it was the father that was Jewish and not the mother, where the traditional definition was matrilineal. So it was the Jewish community that was creating those negative numbers as much as people making their own choices. And so you had sort of two reactions to 1990. One was, let's be more open and welcoming, more inclusive. The reform movement in 1983 passed what they called a patrilineal descent decision, so that a father could be Jewish and help the kid identify as Jewish, not just the mother. And congregations began to be more open. Rabbis began to be more willing to do weddings. And on the other end, you had people trying to focus on Jewish learning and getting Jews to marry Jews. So the Birthright Israel program starts around the year 2000, the late 90s, early 2000s, aimed at people, college and post-college, not by accident, to get them to have a positive, meaningful, intense Jewish experience, and as a not unintended consequence, possibly to find someone they want to marry. And I have actually done a few birthright weddings where people met their partner on birthright. So that was the funder mission achieved. But all this comes out of these surveys that ask questions and sometimes provide interesting details of who we are and what we're doing. So as I mentioned, there have been national studies periodically. Most recently, there was a big one in 1990, another one in 2001. And then the Pew Forum for Religion and American Life did a couple of surveys in 2013 and then again in 2020. And sometimes there are city level studies in Boston, San Francisco that local federations pay for. It's important to understand their community they're serving, but also you have to think of it as market positioning. Who are your clients and who are your customers, i.e. the donors, and how can you best position yourself to meet their needs and also catch their interest. So this report was just issued last month. It's a 218-page report. Even the executive summary is 27 pages. So I went through them. You don't have to go through the whole thing. We'll take a quick tour together. But you can find them if you go to juf.org and you look for the Jewish population study, you'll find the full report if you want it. And you can tell that the priorities of the study, even from the table of contents. So I'm going to share the PDF of the study here so you can see it. And I can close this and I can hide that. Maybe, there we go. All right, so here you have a picture, Jewish Chicago, who we are, and you get seniors and kids and adults. And you even have what I think is a graphic attempt to represent the LGBTQ community as trying to be more inclusive. But if you jump down to the table of contents, you can get a sense of what their priorities are. So a demographic portrait. How old are they? What's the composition of household? Are they married or not? What Jewish denominations are they in? We'll get into all these. Then they ask geographic questions. Where do they live? How long have they been there? Where do they come from? They ask questions of Jewish identity. How do they connect with being Jewish? And what are different ways you can break out those numbers? How many Jewish children are there and how are they being raised? Questions about synagogue and Jewish ritual, organizations and other kind of programs, philanthropy and volunteering. These are all looking for Jewish connections. And then only much later do you get, and you get again, community connections, concerns, Israel. Only in chapter 10 do you get, oh, how much money do they make? How employed are they? What's their education background? I mean, if I were doing a demographic study, I'd be curious about those kind of questions earlier, but they're looking at, of course, through a Jewish lens. This is a JUF sponsored event. The other thing that I find fun about exploring these kind of studies is that you can ask yourself, how would I have answered this question? Because, you know, you could have in fact answered it at some point, but more importantly, you can get a sense of how many other people are like you that are out there that would answer similarly. So they give a summary of their key findings at the beginning. Since 2010, the total number of Jewish households increased by 19%. Total number of people in Jewish households increased by 10%, and the total number of Jewish adults increased by 13%. Now, this is not what people are used to hearing. They're used to hearing decline, 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 we're vanishing, but actually numbers are going up. Now, one of the reasons for this is that they're doing better at counting intermarried households as Jewish households because they're households with a Jew in them. Nearly 3 in 4 Jewish adults in Chicago are married or partnered. So that's up to 74% if you add those two. Among married and partnered adults, 2/3 are unmarried and 1/3 are intermarried. This is actually a little bit lower than the current marriage rates, but we have to remember older couples are less likely to be intermarried than younger couples. So that number has shifted, in fact. 1 in 4 Jewish households are households with minor children. This is also really important because if you spend all your time marketing to parents of school-age children, that's only 1 in 4 households. You're missing out on singles, on older adults, on empty nesters, on people who were never married, so there's a large number of people that don't fit into that category, and too much of the Jewish community programming is focused only on kids. 7% of Metro Chicago Jewish households include an adult or child who identifies as a person of color. That person may or may not be Jewish. You know, the spouse or the child may not identify as Jewish. Only 2% of Jewish adults are persons of color, but a larger share, 7% of Jewish children are persons of color. And this is the more interesting one. The Metropolitan Chicago share of Jewish adults with no Jewish denomination is 44%. So when you ask people, what denomination Jew are you? 44% are saying none of the above, don't fit in that category. So that's really fascinating. If we jump forward to the next page, you have again these numbers represented graphically. The total number of Jewish households is 175,000. Jewish individuals, 319, but total people in Jewish households is 420. And the difference between the second and the third line are those non-Jewish spouses who are in Jewish households. And again, you see that number is about 80,000 here, and then another 18,000 in terms of kids. Now, when it comes to defining Jewish identity, this has been an ongoing debate. Do you let people identify themselves as Jewish, or do you ask, was your mother Jewish? And then you only count those people. In general, the Pew Forum, Pew Research Center has used self-identification, and they use a questionnaire like this. What is your religion? And then if they say, I'm not religious, or I have no religion, do you consider yourself to be Jewish aside from religion? And if they say yes, then they go into a different category. Were either of your parents Jewish, and were you raised Jewish? So you can wind up in a category of Jew by religion. If you say, what's your religion? Jewish. You could be Jew of no religion. If you said, I'm not religious, I don't have a religion, but I do consider myself Jewish in some other way. Or you could be a Jew of multiple religions if you say you're Jewish and Buddhist or Jewish and something else. And then there are also people that they would qualify as Jewish affinity, who consider themselves Jewish but do not have a Jewish parent and were not raised Jewish. They might also be of Jewish background, who don't consider themselves Jewish in any way, but have Jewish parents. So these are people who are sort of connected in some ways, but maybe a further out orbit. Now, again, how you count makes a difference. We in Humanistic Judaism would count Jewish affinity as Jewish because they said, I'm Jewish. That's all we need. So we're a little bit more open in that we would actually have even more Jews than this study produces. But if nothing else, it does provide a way for non-religious Jews to identify. And you might ask yourself, how would I answer that question? If someone said, what's your religion? Would you say Judaism, period? Or would you say something else? And we'll see, and if you look at the studies nationally, a substantial proportion of those who say their religion is Judaism answer questions in a more secular way. They don't go to synagogue very much. They may not be a member anywhere. They may not believe in the God of the Bible. So they might actually be a more secular cultural Jew, but when asked the survey question, they check Jewish by religion. That's what they're used to checking. This also provides, in some cases, some change in numbers since the previous study. So here's a comparison in Jewish population from 2010 to 2020. So Jewish households, you'll notice, has gone up a good amount, 19% change. People in Jewish households has also gone up about 10%. The total number of Jews has only gone up 3%. So that's where you see that intermarriage number changing, because the number of people in Jewish households went up a lot faster than the number of Jews. And the number of Jewish adults went up 13%. Non-Jewish adults went up 21%. Again, you can see those numbers reflected, but the children number actually went down, which means birth rates are not as high as they used to be. And again, we'll see that, you can see that as well when you look at the average age of the Jewish community is somewhat older than the general Chicago population. I'll also point out nationally, you can see that the Jewish population has grown, where in 1970 it was at about 5.4 million, 1990 was 5.5 million, and people were panicked because in 20 years to only go up 0.1 million was really nothing. But now you notice the numbers at 6, 6.4, 6.8. Now we're at 7.5 million or 7.6 million, depending on which study you're following. So we have had a substantial increase in those 30 years from 1990 to 2020, where it's gone up almost 50% from 5.5 to 7.6, a little less than 50%. So the numbers are going up. Again, not the story we're used to hearing. And one of the reasons why those numbers are going up is that we've done a much better job at welcoming and celebrating intercultural families, where they're more likely to make Jewish choices because it's easier and more friendly for them to do so. And the Jewish partners are feeling maybe a little bit more connected as well, so that when they get married, they don't want to leave it behind. They want to bring that experience into their family life. So where did Chicago Jews come from? Where were they born and where did they move from? What I find interesting is that I'm actually the minority experience. Most Jews are living in the city. So you'll see that the city north area has gone from 37 to 49,000. The rest of Chicago has gone from 12 to 20,000. So a large proportion are living in the city. And we know the city's become more residential over time. The near north suburbs have actually gone down in their Jewish numbers. The North Shore has gone up a bit. The northwest suburbs have gone up. And the southern suburbs and western suburbs are more or less unchanged. So there are Jews everywhere, actually, in the Chicagoland area. But the predominance are in the city proper, which is 69,000, or in the north and northwest suburbs, which is about 80,000 or so of the total. How old are the Jews in Chicago? Basic demographic question. Well, here we get the composition of Jewish households. As it mentioned, 25% are households with minor children. But remember, if you're talking about school-age children, that's only K to 12. And K to 12 is being generous, assuming you keep the kids after their bar or bat mitzvahs. So, you know, the proportion of kids who are really in that target market for Jewish education of K through 8, let's say, is even smaller than that 16%. And that's, you know, of households with those kids. And some of them are even younger in pre-K. But you'll notice that a number of households are multi-generational, where you have parents and older adults there. 27% are singles with no children. They could be too young to have had kids yet. That's the 22 to 39, or they could have decided not to have kids or just have never had kids. And then couples with no children, again, you get a large number here, 35%. So you have a higher proportion that are either singles without children or couples with no children than a household with minor kids in it. So we are the minority in our minor kids population, and minor aging out faster than I expect. Now, when you dive into that 25% and ask people about their kids, we get some very interesting numbers as well. So these are of parents of Jewish children. 55% of those Jewish children are being raised by parents where both partners are Jewish. But 36% of the kids being raised Jewish are being raised Jewish by intermarried parents, and another 9% by single parents. We often forget, oh yes, there are still single parents out there. But this is a really fascinating statistic, because now you have to realize that 36% of the kids in your supplementary schools, maybe even in your day schools, if it's a more open community day school, are kids that have one parent that's not Jewish. And so when you do a family tree, or you do a family heirloom project, or you're doing a, how does your family celebrate Hanukkah event, you have to be ready for the reality that a good proportion of the kids participating will have multiple heritages as part of their home experience. And so that's a real shift in the Jewish community. But again, I see it as a very good sign that a good chunk of the Jewish community is being more open and welcoming. That's a positive step. Again, you'll notice if the parents are in-married, 97% of them are raising their kids as Jewish, but a small proportion are saying nothing or something else. Where intermarried parents, it's more of a mix. Some are raising them just Jewish, some are raising them no religion, they're just purely secular. Some are raising them Jewish and something else. So maybe both partners are exposing their kids to elements of their family heritage. And only 9% are being raised totally in other religion. Maybe they make a deal to raise the kids Catholic, and that's what they're going to do. So there's a Jewish parent, but the kids are being raised as another religion. And again, the single parents, 56% are raising them Jewish only, but again, a substantial proportion of either single parents or intermarried parents are raising the kids totally secular, but maybe with some Jewish heritage, not with religion. And again, this is where I wish they had asked different questions, because I'm not sure they ask them, as they do on other studies, are you raising the kids Jewish in another way? Just like you ask the adults, are you Jewish in a non-religious way? Are you raising the kids Jewish in a non-religious way? Wouldn't that be an interesting answer to find? But often the organized Jewish community is dominantly focused on Jewishness as religion. And so they're only going to ask questions about raising kids Jewish by religion, and that's too bad. What kind of Jewish education are these kids getting if they're being raised as Jewish? So here are some interesting numbers about what kind of Jewish education. Any kind at all. Formal Jewish education, like a Sunday school. We're in a Sunday school right now. 32% of Jewish kids aged K to 12 were in a Sunday school, which means 68% were not. In some kind of Jewish education, whether it's a day school or a Sunday school. And that was during 2020 to 2021. It was actually a little bit lower before 2021. Interesting that the online shift made it easier for people to do it. I don't know. But Jewish children in K-12 who never had this form of schooling is 41%. Now, what's the difference between that 41 here and the gap in the 32? It's kids that did do it, but were done, right? They're in that K to 12 age range, but they finished their education. So they are getting some kind of Jewish education. But another metric is, did they have any Jewish life cycle events? Did they have a baby naming when the kid was born, or a bar or bat mitzvah? So they asked that question as well. Any kind of Jewish ritual for the baby, a naming or a circumcision, 68% had something. 57% for male kids had a ritual bris, but a naming ceremony was also 46%, which could be for boys or for girls. And then another 34% got a medical circumcision, which interesting is if you add the ritual plus the medical, that's 57 plus 34 is 91, which leaves you about 10% who either didn't answer or maybe have chosen not to circumcise male children. That's an interesting shift in Jewish practice. Now, having a bar or bat mitzvah ceremony. If you did have it, was it led by a rabbi of a congregation? 67, 2/3 of those who had a bar mitzvah had it with a rabbi. But notice that 13% had a service led by family or friends. or a service not connected to a synagogue, or a rabbi that was just hired for the event. So about 30% of kids celebrating bar and bar mitzvahs didn't do it through a congregational structure. And 6% said they had a bar mitzvah but didn't hold the service. So maybe they went to Israel, had an event there. I'm not sure exactly what that number means. I hope our audience at Kol Hadash doesn't get any ideas on this. But the reality is that this is the new reality, that people are doing bar and bar mitzvahs on their own in separate spaces, not only through a congregational structure. Okay, so now I'm curious about those demographic questions. I want to know, how educated are Chicago's Jews? What kind of incomes do they have? These are much later chapters in the original table of contents, so we have to jump around a bit in the report to be able to see them. So here's an example of the educational attainment of Chicago Jews. So 36% of Chicago's Jews have a bachelor's degree. 42% have a postgraduate degree, master's, PhD, professional degree. Only 7% have only gotten an associate's, and 12% have a high school or less. These are obviously adults, not including kids in that. And then nationally, it points out that the educational attainment is a little bit higher. Among all US Jews, 30% have a bachelor's degree and 28% have a postgraduate degree. So if you add that up, 58% nationally have at least a bachelor's, whereas in Chicago, 78% have a bachelor's or higher. Now, this doesn't provide the comparison to the general US national population, although at the top it does mention among all US Jews, 58% have a college or postgraduate compared to 30% of US adults nationally. In fact, if you break down the numbers, only 11% nationally have a postgraduate degree among all people, compared to 42% for Chicago Jews, and only 18% have college degrees as bachelors, where 36% of. So we are a much more educated population than the general population, and even than the average Jewish population. I mean, that's really shocking. 29% or 30% of US adults nationally have a graduate or postgraduate degree compared to 78% of Chicago Jews. And this also has its impact on incomes. Of course, we know that education is often correlated to income. So here we have a breakdown of Chicagoland Jewish households. And actually the last 10 years have been pretty good. So less than 50,000 in 2010 was about a quarter. Now it's only 14%. The upper levels from 100 to 150,000 went from 14 to 16%. 150,000 or more went from 15 to 26%. And the prefer not to answer doubled. Now you wonder if prefer not to answer is because it's too low or because it's too high and you don't want to say anything. But even if you just look at the number admitting to earning 150,000 or more, that's gone up quite a bit. And again, to compare it to the national US population, the number of, or the percentage of the general population earning 100 to 150,000, which for Chicagoland Jews is 16%, and the general population is 11%. So we're a little more overrepresented there. But earning 150,000 or more in the general population of the US is 8%, earn 150,000 or more, where among Chicagoland Jews, it's 26%. So we're 3 times more likely to have somebody earning 150,000 or more. They also ask an interesting question of self-assessment. Do you cannot make ends meet, just managing to make ends meet, have enough money or comfortable, have extra money, or are actually well off? And you'll notice again, the last 10 years have been pretty good for Chicagoland Jews. And you got many fewer do not answer these because it was just a self-assessment with no numbers attached. But you'll notice the have extra money went up, the well off went up, the comfortable went down a bit, but the managing to make ends meet stayed the same, and cannot make ends meet stayed the same. So that's most likely the people who felt comfortable now feel like they have some extra money. So, you know, the COVID pandemic wasn't disastrous for everybody. As we know, some people managed to maintain paychecks and mortgage payments and everything went just fine. And then the government sent them extra money and it was a bonus for them. They did ask also a question about whether their status changed during the pandemic. Was it worse or somewhat the same? And you'll notice about 60% said it was about the same as before, but 15% says it was somewhat better or even much better than it was before. Well, some did say it was worse, but again, I have to think the general population numbers, if you include all the restaurant workers, all the service workers, the public transit workers, those numbers are much higher in other populations, in professions that Jews are less represented in. So a couple more demographic things that I'm interested in your comments, questions, takeaways. The first one is political views. it is not surprising that Jews tend to be on the liberal end of the spectrum. So you can see it even in this color representation, where blue would be liberal and the darker blue, the more liberal, and moving toward red is more conservative. That's sort of the conventional approach these days. But you'll see that the conservative portion of the Jewish population is only 18%. Then about 18% are moderate, and the rest are some variety of liberal, either extremely liberal or somewhat liberal. That makes already over 50%. And this is reflected in their values when it comes to accepting gay marriage, when it comes to immigration policy, when it comes to taxation policy. Jews tend to vote Democratic about, 3-1, which is this 3/4 to 1/4. So this is an accurate reflection of how Jews vote in practice. And every now and then you'll get Jewish conservatives who try to say, well, this election is the one that the Jews are going to leave the Democratic Party because of Israel or because of whatever. And it tends not to happen. So this is a long-term trend. And finally, in terms of their behavior, this study is very focused on organizational engagement and activities. And we will talk more about the Jewishness of Chicago Jews in the second half, but I want to just finish this and open up for some comments or reactions. So it makes sense that the JUF would be curious about what kind of organizational activities they are interested in following, because they want to track what they're doing and how to connect with them, what might be interesting to them. And you notice how they break it out into these several different categories. So you've got, do you ever talk about Jewish topics? Do you eat Jewish foods? Do you participate in Jewish culture? Do you read Jewish publications? And then they break it out by city far north and all the different subdivisions of the city and the northwest suburbs. And then they also have they have a Jewish engagement type where somebody connects personally. They do it at home. Someone does it visiting other events but not joining themselves. Someone who primarily celebrates holidays, someone who's part of a community, someone who's immersed in Jewish life in this community. So they have these typologies they've created, and then they do these measurements of what do these types do on these things. And you'll notice someone who is personally Jewish at home is more likely to talk about Jewish topics and eat Jewish food than participate publicly in Jewish culture or read a Jewish publication. Whereas someone who's immersed is likely to do all of those things because by definition, they're the ones who do all these things. Like it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They even break it down by what life stage are you? Do you have kids? At what age? And how? I mean, you can see how they're trying to break down. Now, they only got about 5,000 responses to this survey. So you begin to wonder how many people are represented in these categories here. They even break it out by your financial status and which are you more likely to do or not. But overall, you'll notice people who talk about Jewish topics, that's more likely to happen than some of the other behaviors. Jewish foods is still a very popular activity, but again, ever and frequently are very different. Ever could be, I had a Rosh Hashanah dinner with my family. That's ever having Jewish food versus frequently would be, weekly or monthly. And the same thing for participating in Jewish culture and reading Jewish publications, I can imagine is a much lower practice. They also asked about where do they give their money? Again, Jewish United Fund is part of the name. Fundraising is an important part of their activity. So they asked, did you make any donations in the last year? Of all Jewish households, 80% made some charitable donation. That's very good. How many of them were given to Jewish causes? Well, 51% of the households gave to some Jewish organization. 47% gave to both Jewish and non-Jewish organizations. Only 4% only gave to Jewish organizations. And some might say that's a bad sign for the Jewish community. I actually say that's a good sign, that we're engaged in the world around us and we're interested in people that aren't us. And so I find that to be a positive thing. I'll also point out 29% reported that they only gave to non-Jewish organizations. So they don't give to any Jewish charities. And about 15% reported no donation. I guess the other 5% didn't answer or refused to answer. Again, they try to break it out by geography and by personal engagement and by life stage, and you can get lost in all the numbers. But the interesting point for me is that over 50% are still making some Jewish donation, and 29% are not giving to anything Jewish at all. And there's some in the middle who are giving to both. And then the last question to look at before I stop talking for a bit is volunteering. Did you volunteer for any organization at all? 43% of households reported doing some volunteering. 16% did it for some Jewish organization, 9% to both, 7% were to Jewish organizations only, and 27% were to only non-Jewish organizations. Habitat for Humanity, Feed My Starving Children, Bernie's Book Bank. In fact, I'll say that most of the volunteer opportunities we create through Kol Hadash are with non-Jewish charitable organizations. We haven't done, food packing for the Ark or events like that. We tend to do them for more local organizations that are non-denominational or not Jewish specific. So what are some of your takeaways from this survey of Jewish demographic area and data in Chicago? What are the most important details that jump out at you from this? And as a corollary to that, what are we doing right in terms of our programming and activities? And what are we doing? What could we do differently to reach this audience more capably? So I'm interested in asking anybody here or beyond here what they think. Let me just change the mic in case our participant here wants to jump in. Change to, okay. So any comments, thoughts, questions on either the most interesting detail that you saw in there or areas where you see a disconnect between what this is saying and what we're doing? Or if you want me to go back to a particular slide to look at more detail.
Yeah, before I was going to give the folks online if they wanted to jump in first, but what's interesting to me, what jumps out at me is that there's a large group of non-connected Jewish people that don't identify necessarily as religiously Jewish, and this would be a huge opportunity for a secular Jewish organization like Kol Hadash. And I'm a little surprised that we don't find more Jews coming and finding a place like this. So I wonder why that is. If they know about a place like that's secular and doesn't, they're not interested, or are they not connected? They're unaware. So I feel like where would the Jews want to go if they feel not religious and they feel like underrepresented? This would be a place that I think they would naturally move towards, but they don't.
Right. Well, some of it is geographic. You know, we're based in the north suburbs. This is where we do almost all of our programming. And if you look in the North Shore and the northwest suburbs, that's about 60,000 of the 300 and some thousand Jews in Chicago. So we're pulling from that market. We sometimes get people from the near north suburbs because that goes up to Glencoe or so. But a good chunk of Jews are either in Chicago proper or in the western southern suburbs. So that's like 89,000. So a good chunk of the population is not close enough to do stuff with us. And we know that it's not for everybody, but we also know that we have particular audiences that are interested in what we do. So when we look at the intermarriage numbers, we'll also notice where intermarried families tend to live. And if those are a natural market for us because they're more likely to be secular, they're more likely to be raising the kids culturally or open to doing both. But if they're living in the city, River North, or City North, they're unlikely to schlep all the way out here to us. So geography is sometimes a factor. One of the other challenges we have is that we're sort of a paradox. We're a secular Jewish community that has a rabbi and services and a Sunday school. And so for some people, it's where we're listed in the phone book, if there were a phone book anymore, that they're not even looking in the religious community category to find what they're looking for. And we get people all the time who find us and say, wow, I never knew something like this existed. And yeah, I mean, it was true for you, it's true for our new members this year. And I don't know what Google search terms we're not using, but I think some of it is also a kind of imagination question. Are they even thinking that there's enough people like them out there that there could actually be a community that would meet their needs? And hopefully surveys like this begin to raise awareness that there are large numbers of people for whom this message could be really relevant. See, we have a note in the chat as well. Were there questions about attitudes about Israel? Yes, Mike, that's in the second half, don't worry. There's a whole chapter on Israel in the report. I was talking more about the general demographics in the first part, and then we'll go back and talk about the Jewishness pieces later. Yeah, so that's an ongoing challenge for us. We've known for decades that there are Jews out there for whom this might be interesting. Sometimes they find me for a wedding, and that's really all they want. Or I guess the other challenge, and this is more of an issue in places like Los Angeles, Miami, New York, where there are so many Jews and so much Jewish activity through the general, book fairs and authors speaking events and so on, that people don't feel the need to join anything. That they can get their Jewish hook from having a family dinner with their other Jewish friends, or having a Passover Seder with whoever they want to invite. They have family in town, so they just do Jewish things with them. If they need a rabbi, they borrow their cousin's rabbi who's available, and they just don't feel the need to join for themselves. And I guess the last piece is when you're talking about that 3/4 that are not school-age kids population, for them joining a congregation is really an elective. It feels less like a requirement. Parents often feel sort of obligated. I need to give my kids this education, where if you're doing it for yourself, it's an elective. And it may just not be high enough on their priority to search or to look and they might assume it's more expensive. And we had somebody join this year. I told them about our contributing membership option where you can choose what you want to pay. And he said, wow, if I known about that, I would have joined 2 years before. It was there 2 years before, it was on the website 2 years before, but the assumption was that it's going to be too expensive to join. And so that's why again, getting the word out there would be helpful, but sometimes it's people even knowing to look or thinking that it might be possible. So that's a harder sell sometimes, this is even possible, rather than we are the ones that are going to fit what you want. Okay, so let's pick it up with talking more about the Jewishness of Chicago's Jews. And they do some very interesting studies in this. They hadn't done in the previous study. They break out where Jews are from. Not only where were they born, but how they came to be in Chicago. So they asked of all Jewish households, is anyone an Israeli citizen? 3% of Jewish households have an Israeli citizen. 11% have somebody who grew up in a Russian-speaking home, and 9% identify as LGBTQ in some fashion. 9%, by the way, of Jewish households age 75 plus are Holocaust survivors. And 28% of those under 75 are descendants of survivors. So there is a substantial Holocaust connection in the Chicago area that abides even, long post the Skokie migration period. They also asked about racial and ethnic identification. Self-identifying as a person of color, someone in the household is 7%. The individual in the Jewish household is 4%, but 3% of the Jews identify as a person of color, but 7% of Jewish children are Jews of color. And you notice also that those numbers, white only, are going down if you talk about Jewish kids. So the pigmentation complexion of the Chicagoland Jewish community is going to be changing over time. Again, this is a function of intermarriage, but also people converting to becoming Jewish, or simply coming out as Jewish, coming from a background of people of color and racial diversity. I thought I had highlighted the question about where were you born and did you move here, but I don't seem to have that page jotted down. It was interesting that a large proportion of Chicagoland Jews were born in Chicago. Only about a third migrated from elsewhere. I thought it was more of a migratory immigrant kind of city for people living, but among Chicagoland Jews, almost 2/3 were born in Chicago and in the Chicago area and have stayed there. So now let's talk a little bit more about the intermarried population. And you'll notice when you break it down by age, how much it's changed over time. So of all Jews, this is what percentage are married or partnered. So again, those aged 22 to 29, only 43% are married. That makes sense. Of those age 80 plus, 56% are married. Now that could be widows, widowers, as well as divorce. But you'll notice in the other age brackets, it's in the 70s to 80s. So that whole 50% of marriages end in divorce thing, well, I mean, they could have gotten divorced and remarried. That's always possible too. That's also, by the way, sometimes how you get non-Jewish kids in a Jewish household, where you get a couple that has divorced and then they remarry someone from a different religious or cultural background, and those kids are in the household even if they're not being raised with the heritage of a new marriage partner. So of married or partnered Jewish adults, overall 67% of those Jews who are married to someone who's Jewish, and 33% are married to someone who is not. But notice how it changes by age bracket. And the 80 plus of those Jews who are married, 90%, 89% are in married, only 11% intermarried. where if you go down, it begins to be 2/3, 1/3, 2/3, 1/3. But of those who are married, ages 22 to 29, over half are married to a non-Jewish spouse. And the number is also higher for the 30 to 39 bracket than it is elsewhere. So what you'll find is that this is a phenomenon among younger Jews, but that's also why the number of kids in intermarried households is going up, because these are the ones having kids. Those 80-year-olds who are 90% in married are not having any more kids to add to the count. And if you look at the overall married status of Jews, that's also changed over time. So again, 27% are single, 49% in married, 24% intermarried. And they break it out again by geography, but you'll notice that the intermarried number is highest in city other and is relatively low in North Suburbs Lake, which is where we are. North Suburbs Lake County, North Suburbs Cook County, Glencoe, Winnetka, 21%, a little bit higher. But the far northwest suburbs, the intermarried number is much higher. The west suburbs is even higher because they're not moving to stereotypically Jewish areas. They might live anywhere. But this is, again, you mentioned one of the challenges in people finding us. Where the intermarried population is not where we are. Or at least there are some intermarried people here, but not as high numbers as you find in other parts of the city. Okay, so now they ask the question about denominations. How do you identify as Jewish? And you see an explosive growth from 2010 to 2020 in no denomination. So Orthodox has actually stayed about the same. And among all American Jews, it's only 9% that identify as Orthodox. So if people tell you the Orthodox are growing, it's not true. All the population studies, 1990, 2000, 2013, and 2020 have shown the Orthodox population is between 9 and 11% of the American Jews. Now, in certain areas, in Rogers Park, in Borough Park, Brooklyn, it's going to be much higher, but in other parts, they're not going to be there. And, look, Orthodox Jews are visibly Jewish in public. You can count them more easily just visually, where more liberal Jews look like everybody else. And so it's harder to see them sometimes. So another question on denomination is the shift. Notice how the conservative movement crashed. 50% loss of market share is how you'd put it in economics, from 30% to 16%. And reform also went down from 45% to 29%. So that went down substantially. And among US Jews, the reform number is higher actually than even in the Chicago area. And other denominations, that's by the way where Reconstructionists and Humanists fit, we're in the other, stayed the same, but the no denomination went from 14% to 44%. That's a very big jump. Now, we have to assume that who's in that no denomination? Some of those are people who aren't that religious. Some of those are people who are religious but do it on their own. So they might be, personally, they keep kosher at home, but they eat non-kosher food out. And they might be a member of a modern Orthodox synagogue, but they came from a Reform background. And so if you ask them what denomination are you, they don't fit in one category. So they would just say, yeah, I'm no denomination. I'm doing it on my own. There's a whole phenomenon in New York called egalitarian minyanim, where people are just getting together in social circles for prayer and study. And they would say, yeah, we're no denomination because we might have been raised conservative or Orthodox, but we're not really that now. We're just doing it how we want to do it. They're heterodox, making their own choices. So that's been a real shift in the Chicago Jewish community. And it goes on to point out, this is the breakdown more subtly, modern Orthodox to ultra-Orthodox. Again, the modern Orthodox is a more prominent population in the Chicago area than the more ultra-Orthodox. And in the other denominations, we do rate 1 full percent. So take that renewal is less than 1%. And Reconstructionists is a bit larger because there are 2 substantial congregations, one in Evanston and one out here in Wheeling, I think. But again, notice the no denomination. And here's again, talk about market opportunity. 26% call themselves just Jewish of that 44%. 26% is the breakdown of the total 100. So 26% of Chicago's Jews said just Jewish, but 18% self-volunteered, they're secular or culturally Jewish. So in terms of our claim of market share, we're doing pretty poorly too. Because if you add up the 1% who said they were humanistic and the 18% who said they were secular or culturally Jewish, we're only getting 5%, 1/20th of the potential people who could be attracted to our message. So this is definitely an opportunity for us, but also a challenge to say, what are we doing that we need to shift to reach that audience more directly? One of the questions on denominations I love to ask is, what's the change? Because people assume if you're raised Orthodox, you're going to stay Orthodox, but that actually isn't the case. So again, you have the top line numbers of what's the percent of the Chicago Jewish community. And here you have modern Orthodox, those raised modern Orthodox, of those, let's see, current denomination is modern Orthodox, and they were raised Orthodox. So 58% of current modern Orthodox were raised Orthodox. But 28% of them were raised conservative. So a good chunk of conservative Jews actually went more traditional and became more Orthodox. Where only 4% of those raised Reform are now modern Orthodox or some other. So you notice it's actually not Reform Jews who are becoming more traditional. It's a small number. 4% of Reform Jews became modern Orthodox, 8% became other, 7% conservative, but 61% of Reform Jews either stayed Reform, that's the 61%, 24% became other, or 21% just don't have a denomination these days. And for conservative Jews, you notice that a good chunk of those who are today conservative were raised conservative, 71%, but they've also moved quite a bit in other directions. And then asking what kind of Jewish heritage they have, Ashkenazi or Sephardi or Mizrahi. Again, we're a very white Ashkenazi community, even more so than the general American population. And by the way, a good chunk of Jews today don't even claim one or the other. They just say, I don't know, I don't care, I don't fit any of those labels. So they're just generically Jewish, or they converted to being Jewish, and so they don't have that heritage style of Jewish culture. Nationally, it's an even greater number at 17%. Now, when we look at those denominational breakdowns, we have to remember that also doesn't apply to whether they're actually a member somewhere, because you can claim to be Reform and not be a member of a Reform congregation. So here we have, of those who are Orthodox, are they a member of a congregation? Well, 89% are, but of those who say they're conservative, only 48% are members. Of those who say they're Reform, 42% are a member. Now, interestingly, those who say they're another denomination are more likely to be a member because they've chosen something, they have a less common label, so they're more likely to act on that. But this is the interesting phenomenon that you could claim to be these numbers. So even remember that that breakdown that showed that conservatives had 16% of the population in the Chicago area. I'll jump back to that for a second. Yeah, so conservatives were 16%, but half of them aren't members. So only 8% of the Chicagoland Jewish community are members of conservative congregations. Only 15% of Reform Jews, self-identified Reform Jews, are members of Reform congregations. So really the congregational model has really suffered because people aren't staying members or maybe are never becoming members. Although this does suggest that a good chunk were members at one point. So of all Jewish adults in Chicago, 35% are current members, 29% are former members, and 36% were never members. But what this means, when you translate the numbers to reality, where the rubber hits the road, at any one moment, 2/3 of Chicagoland Jews are not a member anywhere. So we who are members of communities are actually the minority experience. But if you ask, have you ever been a member? 2/3 have some congregational membership experience at some point. So in theory, they could be convinced to come back, or they've learned their lesson and they want nothing to do with it and they're never going to come back. But then you have that 36% who were never members. And you have to ask, why were they never members? Well, maybe they couldn't find the right fit. They didn't know what to look for. Maybe they tried something for visiting and didn't like the experience. Maybe they live in an intense Jewish community like the Russian Jewish community that has, their friends are all Russian Jews. They do it their own way. They have their own sort of communal events and they never made a formal community out of it. And they're happy with that. So there is a piece of that number that might be appealable, but there's also a piece that is just not looking for a community and they're happy with where they are. And if they come to me for a wedding, that's as much as they need. And when it comes to being a member of a synagogue, you see again, 1/3 of Jewish adults reside in a synagogue member household. but that just means someone in the household is a member. It could be a single member in a household of multiple people. Also, denominational affiliation is different from membership, as we pointed out, where a substantial proportion of people are not members of synagogue. A good chunk of Jewish adults attended some type of service in the last 6 months, and 18% attended services monthly or more. So notice how badly we do at drawing people monthly, but we do okay at getting them once in a while. And about half of Jewish adults attended a high holiday service in some fashion in 2020. Now, interestingly, during the pandemic, nearly all adults in synagogue member households attended religious services at least once. So they stayed connected if they were already connected. 85% went to high holidays, and that might actually be higher than would have done it, in a normal year. Among Jewish adults who are not part of member synagogue households, 1 in 3 went to religious services, and more than 1 in 4 went to high holidays. Now, I don't know if that's up from a typical year. I guess it's a good number of people buy guest tickets or whatever for services, but maybe 28% is higher. You'll also notice, again, they're measuring these religious rituals, lighting Shabbat candles, but only 10% light it almost always or always. Take out the Orthodox number, the number of non-Orthodox Jews doing that is very, very small. But doing a Shabbat meal at least once or once in a while, that's about a third. So doing it episodically certainly is possible. 60% did a Passover Seder, 80% lit Hanukkah candles in a typical year, even 40% fasted for Yom Kippur. Actually, a higher percent fast in Yom Kippur than are members of synagogues, because you can do that on your own. And again, only 13% of Jewish households keep kosher at home. So when it comes to things that affect your life every day, we're less likely to do it. Or every week with Shabbat, we're less likely to do it. But once in a while, we'll do that. 14% increased their engagement in Jewish life, and 1/4 decreased their participation in Jewish life during the pandemic. And that actually tracks. We did have a somewhat of a dip in our membership numbers from last year to this year, because some people chose to step back while other people chose to step up. They also asked some interesting questions about non-religious behaviors. Did you participate in a Jewish educational program or a Jewish cultural program? Of course, people could pick more than one of these, right? They could do all of the above. But it is interesting that there are people who have connections that are political when it comes to Jewish sponsored events. These are all categories of things that we, in theory, could offer as a community. We certainly do educational opportunities. We do cultural events. We do religious. We do some charitable work with volunteering opportunities. We definitely have social activities. We haven't done as much political activism, but that, again, we have our historical reasons for that, and we don't always have a consensus on what our stance would be on a particular issue. We also want to look at how they identify in general terms about what's important to being Jewish, not just what they choose to do, but in broader reaches. So here we have, they asked, which of these is important to being Jewish? And is it essential, or is it somewhat important? So here are the ones who said these things are essential to being Jewish. 82% said leading an ethical and moral life is essential to being Jewish. 77% said remembering the Holocaust. But when it came to praying or spiritual connection, only 29% said that was essential to being Jewish. Now, they might have said it was somewhat important to being Jewish. And yes, we are a 501c3, so we are eligible for that donation behavior too. But again, you'll see that these numbers, the praying spiritual connection, and notice how it differs by region. So city far north, 49% said praying and spiritual connection was important, but that's where the predominant Orthodox population is. Where the further north you get, when you get to north suburbs Lake, 29%, you get the far northwest suburbs, 21%. So the religion number goes down as you get into those higher intermarried populations and less Jewish areas. You could ask the same thing about stage of life. Our prime target seems to be couples who are 70 plus and singles 22 to 39. Good luck creating programming that's going to appeal to couples who are 70 plus and singles who are 22 to 39. That's going to be a challenge. And actually, the ones who are well off are more secular. The ones who are struggling may be more religious. Interesting details in the sub numbers. Now, they did ask some interesting questions as well about why are you not more engaged? What has inhibited your connection to the Jewish community? Because that's actually very useful information to know. 19% said, I don't know that many Jewish people. 18% said, I haven't found any interesting Jewish activities. The pandemic certainly was an inhibition. I'm not confident in my Jewish knowledge. Why would that inhibit you? Well, I don't want to go to a synagogue and not have any idea what's going on or not know what page they're on, and people will think I'm stupid and I'll feel, even less Jewish than if I didn't go. So there's a feeling that you might feel unwelcome for whatever reason. And 7% think that their political views might be unwelcome. This actually goes both directions. Some feel if they're politically conservative, they might not be welcome in a more liberal congregation, all the focus on social justice and community activism in left-wing Jewish communities. But in some cases, it also has to do with Israel politics, because if people are more Israel critical or even would identify as non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, they might assume that they won't be welcome in our community. In fact, we had someone come to our Sukkot event who came up to me afterwards and said they really liked the service and this was totally a good fit for them, but they were curious, what's our position on Zionism in Israel, and would we be open to someone being a member who's not a big fan of Israel, to put it mildly. And I said, we take all types. We're open to the conversation. We have a range of perspectives in the community already, and that can be a respectable Jewish alternative. So this is, but they were very trepidatious in asking me about this. They were worried I was going to jump on them and condemn them as terrible. And so there's a clutch of people who wouldn't be comfortable for that reason as a political factor. And then again, there's something else not so helpful. But this is one of our challenges, is to overcome that hump. And they had some quotes about why they haven't gotten involved. I was raised Jewish. I don't remember a lot of the Jewish stories and customs. I don't know many Jewish people. And the ones I do know, I have trouble making connections outside of religion. So again, if it's all services and if it's all religious events, it's tough to connect. I've only been seriously observant as an adult, so I'm off kilter because of my less extensive Jewish knowledge. I'm a student. I don't have a lot of money to pay for dues or anything like that, but I'm a graduate student, so Hillel on campus doesn't work. Of course, most congregations will cut you a break if you can't afford dues, but they don't want to ask or can't think to ask. We're more to the right politically than many people. As I'm a progressive person, my views are unpopular, so you see both sides, right? I do strongly identify with being Jewish culturally, but I'm not religious. So I find it difficult to find the right community, connect with others who are similar. I'm also not married to a Jewish person. He's an atheist who doesn't care about any of it. So the non-Jewish partner is not dragging the kids to church. The non-Jewish partner is not religious at all, even more secular than the other one. So my partner isn't pushing me to find this kind of community either. Yeah, again, Mike says, have them go to an SHJ meeting. Like, yes, come to one of our programs. Like, you might actually find it. In fact, my favorite quote, they had some open answer questions at the end. There's a lack of options. I would prefer to belong to a humanistic synagogue with a full-time rabbi, but there isn't one in the area. Well, however, it doesn't say where that person lives, right? And if they know the word humanistic and the idea that there is a humanistic synagogue, okay, my guess is they know who we are. That's not a lack of knowledge. It's just they might be living in the far southwest suburbs, or so it's not convenient to where they are, and so then it doesn't work. But I love that quote at the end. There isn't one around here. So now when they asked about Israel, which is a question someone had raised in the chat earlier, this I found really interesting. So do they agree or disagree with these statements? It's important look at the bottom first. It's important for Israel to be a democratic state. 75% strongly agree, 50% somewhat agree, a very small number say, who cares? It's important for Israel to be a Jewish state. Again, an overwhelming number say, yes, that's 70, 80%. It's important for it to be a Jewish state, not just a neutral democratic state with no caring for Jews specifically. I feel proud of Israel's accomplishments, again, over 80% on that one. American Jews have the right to criticize the Israeli government. Here we begin to see a bit of a shift, about 17% saying, probably not. Again, a large number, 75% saying, yes, Israel can be criticized by American Jews. Caring about Israel is an essential part to being Jewish. Again, 75% say yes, but there's a certain number that say no. But I'll point out that the no's in the have a right to criticize are very different than the no's in caring about Israel is essential, okay? So the ones who say it's not essential to care about Israel are probably less connected to Israel, more likely to criticize. And the ones who say American Jews do not have the right to criticize are more likely to be much more connected and engaged. Okay. Israel lives up to its human rights values. Again, you've got a 34% number there that's saying either I disagree, strongly disagree, or somewhat, and only about 52% say yes, it does. So here we begin to see some of that disagreement. And now the last one, I describe myself as a Zionist. 45%, 47% said no to some degree, and only 40% said yes. Now, they didn't necessarily define what Zionist means. Just like you ask, do you identify as Jewish? You don't ask questions beyond that. So for some, they might say, well, I'm not Zionist because I didn't move to Israel. If Zionism means all Jews should move to Israel, and I didn't move there, then I'm not a Zionist, even if I care about it, even if I think it's doing a good job on human. I mean, you could be a pro-Israel supporter and not necessarily call yourself a Zionist. On the other hand, if you think Zionism is a sort of religiously inflected claim to all the land and excluding Palestinians and oppressing them, and then you might say, I'm not a Zionist for that reason, because Zionism is this right-wing, manifest destiny, racist exclusion. And then there are others who might identify as Zionists who don't live there and see Zionism as a statement of ethnic self-determination. People should have the right to their own ethnic cultural states, just as the French do, the Germans do, the Czechs do, separate from the Slovaks. They split because they wanted their own states. So why not have a Jewish state? And you might even support a Palestinian state with a Zionism like that. So they didn't clarify that, but it is interesting to see how the self-identification as Zionist has gone down historically. From if you went 50 years ago, that number would have been very, very different. So again, opening up for comments, discussions, questions. One comment in the chat: Zionism now has a kind of active, strident connotation. Like am I an activist? I give money to causes. I might go to a protest once in a while. I don't know that I would call myself an activist, but some would say if you donate to causes, you're an activist. So Zionism as well has a sense of either all or nothing. Like, are you a patriot or not? We might say in the American context. So that might apply for the labeling of Zionism as well. Any other thoughts or takeaways? I will tell you a couple of questions I wish they had asked that they didn't. I mentioned the case of raising kids culturally Jewish, would have been nice to see. And they also didn't ask any, as far as I can tell, any belief questions. What do you believe? In the Pew National Study of American Jews, they asked, do you believe in the God of the Bible, in a spiritual force of something else, or do you not believe in either the God of the Bible or some kind of spiritual force? And in national numbers, 27% of Jews said they believed in the God of the Bible. 50% said they believed in some kind of spiritual force. And 22% said they did not believe in either a God of the Bible or any spiritual force. So again, that's our market. That's that 20% who say they're secular cultural Jews or humanists, or the 22% who don't believe in the God of the Bible or a spiritual force. And we might even get some of those spiritual force people too, if we're open-minded enough about it. So I find these surveys to be a really interesting reflection of who we are as a community, but also what we need to work with. Jason asked, did they ask about experiences with anti-Semitism? You bet your booty they did. Again, this is a Jewish community program, and what I'll do is I'll take you to the table of contents, and you can see how much I decided not to focus on that in this, but it definitely was a core focus of the study. So here we have demographic, geography, Jewish identity, education, Israel. Where did I miss? There was definitely a section on anti-Semitism. Oh, here we go. Concern over anti-Semitism and current events. So that's 131. Here we go. So they ask questions about how concerned are you about anti-Semitism? And 67% are concerned about both anti-Semitism in the US and globally. Among American Jews, 45% say there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the US. And 7% reported they were personally victim of some kind of anti-Semitism in the last year. So out of 300,000, 1% would be 3,000. So that's about 20,000 with some experience. But then they do break it down in terms of what did that mean for you? Again, this is Chicago Jews concerned about anti-Semitism around the world or being a victim in the past year. You notice geographically, more likely in city far north, city other, and north suburbs Kirk, less likely in northwest suburbs, far northwest. So it's actually not that common anywhere, but it's even less common in those less Jewish areas. You are more likely to see it if you're an immersed Jew than if you're an episodic personal Jew. Age range, for some reason, the 40 to 69 were more targeted. Personally a victim in the last year, again, a good number said no, even of the people who said, I'm very concerned, but 2/3 of them didn't experience any. I'm not sure exactly how that number breaks down between 68 and 87 in the same column. Now, what were your personal experiences that they had? Was it mild, moderate, or intense? Or couldn't classify it? Okay, so these are just the number of respondents. This is not percentage-wise. So 38% said mild, 77 moderate. What were they? Slurs and jokes is the largest number. Generic negatives about Jews, stereotypes about appearance and money, discrimination for ethnic reason, politics about the US and Israel, or something else. Again, most of these are, not on the other category, but have some clear definition. And this is something they had to derive from sort of open answer questions and then clump them into categories. But notice the format here. The largest proportion were just verbal, someone saying something to your face. Or indirect means that you hear someone else saying it to someone else. Harassment or assault is only 26 raw number of the people who reported something. And where was it? At work, more often, in public, online, it does happen for sure. And then, of course, others always a possibility. So there are some interesting experiences detailed here. It does seem, though, that there's a lot more concern about what might be happening rather than raw data suggesting there is actually a large wave of things happening. If 7% of Jews had experienced an assault, that would have shown up at much greater numbers. But sometimes what happens is you hear about somebody who had something and then you count as a statistic for, I experienced anti-Semitism, when it was one incident that gets counted like 3 times. So it's a very tricky thing to try and count anti-Semitic incidents. There was the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee recently released a report on anti-Semitism that seemed to suggest that 300,000 Jews in America had experienced some kind of anti-Semitism. And if that had been happening, like a wave of pogroms hitting that many, we would have seen a lot more news about it. There were incidents for sure. Some of them were violent. Some Jews were killed. I mean, there have been terrible episodes. But as a whole, compared to Germany of the 1930s or Poland of the, or Russia of the 1890s, we're living in a very different world. All right. Well, thanks for exploring these numbers with me. I find sometimes a dive in the numbers can be really useful and interesting. One of the things actually the 2010 study did for Kol Hadash, when we saw that even then only 25% of households had kids with school-age children, we said we need to reorient how we're promoting who we are, what kind of pictures we're putting on our website. If we only have pictures of parents and kids, then these older adults or people without kids are going to say, well, this is just a school community. This doesn't have anything for me. And so we consciously tried to beef up our social programming, our adult-only programming, and our visual representation of who we are. One debate that actually we're going to be going through as we do website revisions going forward is we saw that 7% of kids who are being raised Jewish are Jews of color. We don't have any currently in our community who are visibly Jews of color. We have some with Indian heritage from India. We have plenty of white mixing, but that doesn't show up in a picture in the same way. So do we purchase stock photos of Jews of color doing things like spinning dreidels and lighting menorahs, or do we just wait until we get members and then we photograph the heck out of them? Put them, I mean, it's a crass calculus, but the challenge is that just like with LGBTQ Jews, if they don't see themselves represented on your site, they won't necessarily know that they feel comfortable and welcome there. So when we redid our site the last time, when we were choosing families to feature, we made sure to feature a lesbian couple that have the kid in the Sunday school, because we wanted to make sure that the LGBTQ know that when we say you're welcome and included, we mean it, to the point that we're willing and happy to highlight a family of that demographic. So we'll have to see how we best position ourselves with a deep dive into this report. And again, there are numbers we'd like to break out differently. Maybe they'll make those available at some point. And we have to think geographically. You know, honestly, we're unlikely to, we have a few members who come from far away, but most of our members are going to be North Lake County, Northern Cook County, the Northwest suburbs, closer in, not really much farther than Vernon Hills or, you know, out that way. And so who are those Jews is going to be as much an important question for us as who are Chicago's Jews more broadly.